Jamal Brown wasn't looking for a fight. He kept to his routine, walking the neighborhood with his dog Shadow at his side, just trying to stay clear of trouble. But trouble wasn't interested in leaving him alone. They had been testing him for weeks, pushing their luck a little further each time, certain there would never be consequences. Then came the day they took it too far. Words weren't enough anymore. They wanted something more. Pain followed, and Shadow, the only one who had ever stood between Jamal and the world, paid the price. They thought Jamal would break. They thought he would fold beneath their lies. They were wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The day had unfolded much like the ones before it, with the sun casting its warm glow over the cracked sidewalks and narrow streets of Jamal Brown's neighborhood, as if it meant to disguise the quiet tension that simmered beneath the surface of the town. The air felt thick in his lungs, not from the weather, which was mild enough for late spring, but from the weight of something far heavier than heat. The unspoken truths that lingered in every glance, in every forced smile from neighbors who pretended not to see the things they could no longer deny. Jamal's feet carried him down the familiar path from school to home, each step steady and measured, as though the rhythm might anchor him against the slow, grinding erosion of his patience. He had grown used to the looks, the whispers just loud enough for him to catch fragments of contempt as they passed by, used to the way teachers chose silence over justice, the way hallways seemed to narrow when certain boys prowled them with sneers carved deep into their faces. He had learned long ago that in this place, survival depended less on raising one's voice and more on knowing when to absorb the blows and when to steel oneself for the storm that followed. Shadow padded at his side, the old German shepherd's paws making a soft, familiar sound against the pavement, a sound that had become a quiet comfort in the chaos of Jamal's daily life. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, his eyes sharp with an intelligence that seemed to understand far more than mere commands. Shadow had been his uncle's companion first, a protector in the truest sense, and when cancer had taken Uncle Ray, the bond had passed seamlessly to Jamal, as though the dog himself had known who would need him most. They walked together through the stretches of their neighborhood that felt both too tight and too exposed, passing houses with pristine lawns that seemed to glare disapproval without a single word being spoken. Children played beneath the watchful eyes of their parents, who would gather them a little closer when Jamal and Shadow drew near, their smiles brittle and insincere. He felt it all, not as a sudden rush, but as a steady, suffocating tide, one that pulled at him day after day, daring him to drown beneath its weight. School had been no better. It never was. In the classrooms, he endured the subtle dismissals of teachers who expected less from him before he'd even opened his mouth, their gazes sliding past him as though he were furniture rather than flesh and blood. Lunchtime offered no refuge, the cafeteria a hunting ground for those like Mark Pearson and his crew, boys who wore entitlement like armor, their varsity jackets a badge of their perceived invincibility. They didn't need to lay a hand on Jamal to make their presence felt. A careless laugh at his expense, a shove disguised as an accident in the crowded hallway, or the muttered slurs spat beneath their breath were weapons sharp enough to leave invisible wounds. Even in the sanctuary of the boxing gym, where the scent of sweat and leather mingled with the echo of fists meeting heavy bags, their specter lingered. He would catch sight of them sometimes, loitering just beyond the windows, watching him train with narrowed eyes as if they could somehow strip him of his strength simply by existing. They never confronted him there, not yet, but the promise of it hung in the air, like the thick humidity before a storm. Today felt no different, yet something beneath the surface of routine gnawed at him with quiet persistence. Jamal had barely stepped inside the house when he felt it crawling beneath his skin, an itch of unease he couldn't quite place. His mother had worked a double shift at the hospital and wouldn't be home until late, and his father was still at the garage, wrestling with an old engine that refused to yield. The silence of the house pressed in on him, hollow and restless, and without thinking, he reached for Shadow's leash. "Come on, boy," Jamal said softly, his voice low, but carrying the weight of routine between them. Shadow rose from his spot near the door with a quiet groan of old joints, tail wagging lazily as he nuzzled Jamal's hand. There was no hesitation, no need for command beyond the unspoken understanding that had long existed between them. They stepped out into the fading light of day, the sun already beginning its descent beyond the rooftops, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Jamal's gaze drifted ahead, past the rows of houses, past the parked cars lining the street, until it landed on the open stretch of park, where the path curved just beyond the playground. And there they were. Mark Pearson stood at the center, flanked by Kyle Miller and another of their kind, their red and white varsity jackets unmistakable even at a distance. They lounged as if they owned the ground beneath their feet, their postures dripping with the kind of casual menace that came from knowing they would never be held accountable for the weight of their actions. Mark's eyes found Jamal's across the distance, a slow, crooked smile spreading over his face like oil on water, thin and toxic. Jamal's steps did not falter, nor did his expression betray the flicker of heat rising in his chest. He kept his face composed, as he always had, but inside something shifted. Something small but sharp, as though the day itself had just exhaled its long-held breath and revealed the storm that had been gathering all along. The distance between them felt heavier than the mere stretch of pavement and grass that separated their feet. It carried the weight of unspoken history, of slights and provocations that had accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a riverbed. Dark and suffocating. Jamal held his posture steady, his shoulders set, his gaze forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hesitation. He felt Shadow at his side, the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing, the subtle tension in his frame as those keen eyes fixed themselves on the figures ahead, reading the moment for what it was long before words would ever be exchanged. Mark Pearson's lazy smirk deepened as he shifted his weight, one hand slipping into the pocket of his varsity jacket, the other gesturing to his friends as if he were a ringmaster drawing attention to the opening act of a performance they had no doubt already rehearsed in their minds. Kyle Miller, never far from Mark's shadow, let out a short, hollow laugh, the kind that lacked humor but dripped with cruelty, like a blade dragged slowly across stone. The third boy, Tanner McKee, another face from the same mold of privilege and malice, tilted his chin toward Jamal with a sneer pulling at his lips, as though they were all silently daring him to pretend he didn't notice their gathering storm. Jamal's steps remained unbroken, a quiet defiance in every stride. He had learned, over time, that silence was its own kind of armor, a shield that frustrated boys like them more deeply than any shouted retort or flaring temper ever could. But even so, as the space between them narrowed, he felt the flicker of heat behind his sternum, a smoldering ember fanned by the memory of every hallway shove, every whispered insult left to hang in the air without consequence. Mark's voice carried across the park, loud and sharp against the hush of the fading evening. "Look who it is," he drawled, dragging out the words as if they were sticky with disdain. "Out for a walk with his mutt, like some stray looking for scraps." The others chuckled on cue, their laughter thin and spiteful, but it was not the sound of humor. It was the sound of predators circling, of boys who had always believed themselves untouchable. Jamal felt Shadow stiffen at his side, a low, almost imperceptible growl rising in the dog's throat, not loud enough to draw attention, but deep enough that Jamal could feel it vibrating through the leash in his hand. He did not respond, did not grant them the satisfaction of acknowledgement, though he could feel their eyes crawling over him like insects, probing for any crack in his composure they might exploit. He kept walking, the leash firm but gentle in his grip, Shadow's pace matching his own with practiced precision. But Mark was not content to let the moment slip away so easily. He took a slow step forward, boots crunching against the gravel path, his presence swelling as if he meant to fill the space between them with his arrogance alone. "What's the matter, Brown? Dog forget how to bark?" His smirk twisted into something meaner, something uglier, as he nodded toward Shadow. "Maybe it knows better than to make noise when it's around real men," Kyle snorted, emboldened by Mark's lead. "Yeah, don't want to end up in the pound like the rest of the strays in this dump," he jeered, his eyes narrowing with a flash of glee as the insult hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. For a heartbeat, Jamal considered the weight of their words, the invitation to engage, to crack the still mask he wore so tightly over the simmering rage beneath. But he remembered his uncle's teachings, the lessons forged in sweat and bruises beneath the dim lights of the old gym. Control is power. Never give them your fire until it burns too hot to be denied. So he said nothing, not with his voice, but with the set of his jaw and the unflinching steel in his gaze. He kept walking, guiding Shadow with him, though he could feel the tension thrumming like a taut wire ready to snap. Mark's eyes followed him, narrowing slightly, as if the absence of reaction only deepened his determination to provoke one. "You think you're too good to talk to us, huh?" he called after Jamal, raising his voice louder now, so that even the distant joggers and scattered park-goers might hear. "You think because you got those fancy gloves and that scruffy mutt at your side, you're better than us?" Jamal's lips pressed together, a fine line of quiet defiance. And though his pace never faltered, he felt the burn of their stares searing into his back as they began to follow, not running, not lunging, but drifting closer with the slow inevitability of a tide drawing in, determined to pull him under. Shadow's growl deepened, a rumble now that was unmistakable, and Jamal tightened his grip on the leash, not to restrain, but to anchor himself, to keep his focus sharp as they drifted further into dangerous territory. The path curved ahead, leading toward a more secluded stretch of the park, where the cover of trees would swallow the evening light, where the noise of the world grew softer, and the echoes of confrontation could rise unhindered. And as they moved, as the bullies closed in behind him like a gathering storm, Jamal felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest, a steady, unshakable understanding that the moment he had long anticipated was no longer a distant threat, but a present, living thing. There would be no escape from it, no sidestep wide enough to avoid the inevitable collision that awaited him at the end of the path. But even as the shadows lengthened and the air grew tight with expectation, Jamal did not waver. He walked into the deepening dusk with Shadow at his side and fire smoldering quietly beneath his calm exterior, readying himself for whatever storm would break first, the one in the sky or the one gathering fast behind him. "You know," Mark Pearson's voice rang out again, closer now, carrying a sharp edge that sliced through the thickening air. "I still think about that day in gym class, Brown. You remember it, don't you?" He laughed, a bitter sound, thick with memory and mockery. "Yeah, you remember. The rope climb. You barely made it off the ground before you were hanging there like a sack of dead weight." Kyle's laughter followed, shrill and eager, like kindling feeding off a growing fire. "Coach Simmons kept yelling at you like you had a chance," he sneered, jogging a few paces forward to close the gap between them, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement. "Thought you were gonna cry, man. Thought you were gonna blubber right there in front of everybody." Jamal kept walking, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed ahead on the narrowing path, as though the horizon itself held his focus. Yet inside, he felt their words coil around his ribs, squeezing like a slow vice, pressing against old wounds that had never fully healed. He breathed deep through his nose, controlled and measured, though he could not deny the sharp sting of those memories, brought back to life by their venomous tongues. Mark wasn't finished. He stepped closer still, his shoulder brushing past Kyle as he fell into a predatory stride, keeping pace just behind Jamal. "Or what about last month?" he continued, his voice low and oily, dripping with the satisfaction of cruelty well practiced. "You remember, don't you? When the whole class watched you bomb that history presentation. You looked like you wanted the floor to open up and swallow you whole." "That's enough," Jamal said, his voice quiet but edged with steel, cutting through their jeers like a blade honed not for theatrics, but for precision. He did not raise his volume, nor did he quicken his pace, but there was something in the way he spoke, something in the way the words settled heavy in the air, that made even the wind pause in its passing. But boys like Mark Pearson, drunk on their own sense of invulnerability, mistook calm for weakness and patience for permission. His smirk only deepened, as if Jamal's refusal to rise to the bait had granted him open season on every scar he had ever carved into Jamal's life. "Or maybe you're thinking about the cafeteria last week," Mark pressed on, eyes gleaming with the thrill of dominance. "When your tray slipped out of your hands, and you were down there on your knees scraping your lunch off the floor like a damn janitor." Jamal's fingers tightened imperceptibly around Shadow's leash, the rough weave pressing into his palm, grounding him in the moment as rage simmered beneath the surface of his composure. His breath came slower, deeper, every inhale feeding a quiet fire, every exhale tempering it to embers that refused to flicker out. "You talk a lot for someone who's never stepped in the ring," Jamal replied, his voice low and steady, words falling with the weight of granite into the space between them. He didn't glance over his shoulder, but he felt the slight hesitation ripple through the boys, a flicker of something uncertain beneath their bravado, like the first tremor of doubt at the edge of a storm. Mark scoffed, shoving aside the unease with the bluster of practiced cruelty. "We don't need a ring to put you down, Brown," he snapped, his bravado hardening like cooling iron. He sidled even closer now, close enough that Jamal could sense the heat of his presence at his back, the sour breath of entitlement curling in the air between them. "Out here, it's just us, and nobody's coming to save you." Kyle, emboldened, stepped around to Jamal's side, his shoulder brushing Jamal's arm as he mocked, "Yeah, where's your corner now, fighter boy?" Jamal's eyes flicked toward Kyle, a slow, deliberate turn of his gaze that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. "I never needed a corner," he answered, quiet and controlled, yet so heavy with truth that the words seemed to thud against their chests. "Not to handle boys like you." There was a beat of silence, a pause stretched taut between them like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Then, like a spark thrown onto dry tinder, Kyle's lips curled into a sneer, and he barked, "Let's see about that." Without warning, Kyle shoved Jamal hard against the shoulder, the force unbalancing him just enough to rock his frame. It wasn't the strength of the push that mattered. Jamal had weathered far greater impacts in the ring, but the message it carried, the line it crossed, the match it lit beneath the smoldering heap of provocations they had piled high around him. The shove had barely landed when Shadow exploded into motion, the leash snapping taut as the dog lunged forward with a ferocious snarl that tore through the hushed evening air. His teeth bared, muscles coiled with instinctual protection, Shadow became a living storm between Jamal and the threat, his presence no longer passive, no longer restrained. Time seemed to slow in that heartbeat, the park folding into a quiet void where only the growl of fury and the widening eyes of the bullies remained, the moment hanging at the precipice of chaos, poised to tip. Kyle staggered back first, his face blanching as he raised his hands in pitiful defense, eyes wide with the sudden, jarring realization that their game had turned into something far more dangerous than the petty cruelty they had grown so accustomed to wielding without consequence. Shadow's teeth snapped just shy of Kyle's arm, his snarl rising in pitch, filling the space between them with raw, unfiltered menace. "Get that thing off me!" Kyle shouted, his voice climbing into a high, panicked register that stripped away every ounce of bravado he had worn like a second skin. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet in his haste. But Mark, too proud and too slow to understand the shift in the air, lunged forward with a furious glare twisting his features. "Stupid mutt!" Mark roared, swinging his foot in a vicious arc toward Shadow's ribs. The blow connected with a sickening thud, the impact jolting through the dog's body. But Shadow, gritting through the pain with the sheer ferocity of loyalty, twisted mid-strike and sank his teeth into the cuff of Mark's jeans, dragging him off balance with surprising strength. Mark cried out, stumbling as Shadow yanked hard, his voice cracking under the sudden weight of fear. Tanner, caught between action and retreat, hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. And in that gap, Shadow's fierce gaze found him, eyes burning like embers fanned to flame. The dog released Mark and lunged toward Tanner, snapping his jaws inches from the boy's thigh, forcing him to stagger back with a yelp of pure panic. "It's biting! It's biting!" Tanner shrieked, his voice ragged with terror as he scrambled away, kicking clumsily at the ground in a desperate attempt to put distance between himself and the snarling defender. Shadow pressed the attack, his growls rolling low and relentless, his body a battered but unyielding wall between Jamal and the trio of aggressors. Pain flared through the dog's side where Mark's kick had landed, but he bore it with grim determination, eyes fixed on the threat, breath coming in hard, shallow bursts as he held his ground with the tenacity of a creature who knew no other way but to fight. "Do something, Mark!" Kyle shouted, his voice fraying at the edges, panic unraveling what little courage he had left. "It's gonna kill us!" But Mark, pale now beneath the bravado that had once painted his features in smug confidence, was already retreating, backing away with uneven steps, his eyes darting from Shadow's bared teeth to Jamal's unflinching form behind the dog. He spat a curse, sharp and venomous, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Forget it! Let's go!" Without waiting for agreement, Mark turned and bolted, his heavy steps pounding against the earth as he fled. Kyle and Tanner, their fear overtaking whatever reckless courage they had carried into this confrontation, scrambled after him, their retreat clumsy and frantic as they tripped over roots and stumbled through uneven ground, their panicked breaths loud in the hush that followed. Shadow gave a final, thunderous bark, driving them further into their cowardly escape, his chest heaving as he stood his ground a moment longer, watching to ensure they would not dare turn back. Only when the distance between them had stretched far enough, when their figures had blurred into the shadows between the trees, did Shadow stagger back toward Jamal, the adrenaline that had fueled his defense now ebbing, leaving behind the harsh, brittle edges of pain. Jamal dropped to his knees beside him, his heart pounding a ragged rhythm against his ribs as he ran his hands gently over Shadow's flank, searching for the damage he already feared was there. His fingertips brushed against the tender spot where Mark's kick had landed, and Shadow let out a low, strained whimper, his body trembling beneath Jamal's touch. "You held them off, boy," Jamal murmured, his voice roughened by a storm of emotions that churned beneath the surface. Fear, fury, helplessness, all coiling together in his chest. His hand lingered on Shadow's side, feeling the tremors that shuddered through the loyal creature's frame. "You held them off." But even as the words left his lips, they rang hollow in his ears, for he could see the way Shadow's legs trembled beneath him, the way his breathing came in shallow gasps, his strength draining fast from the effort of defending his master. Jamal swallowed hard against the knot rising in his throat, his eyes burning not from the sting of sweat, but from the searing weight of what he could not undo. The boys had fled, yes, driven off by Shadow's ferocity, but the damage had been done, and the evidence of their cruelty lay there at Jamal's side, breathing unevenly against the blood-streaked earth. As Jamal cradled Shadow closer, pressing his forehead against the dog's fur in a moment of silent, desperate gratitude laced with fear. He could not shake the grim certainty settling over him. This battle might have been won, but the war was far from over. And somewhere, deep in his chest, that ember of quiet fire flared hotter, fed by the injustice of what had just unfolded, by the realization that the storm they had unleashed had only just begun to gather strength. The park felt too quiet once the bullies ran off, like the fight had taken all the sound with it and left behind only the heavy thud of Jamal's heartbeat in his ears. He knelt by Shadow, his hands moving over the dog's side, feeling how shaky his breathing was, how hard it had become for him to hold himself up. Fear settled deep in Jamal's chest, heavy and cold, like a weight he couldn't push away no matter how tightly he gripped the leash. "You're all right," Jamal said, more to convince himself than anyone else, keeping his voice steady even though it wanted to crack. He ran his hands along Shadow's ribs, and his stomach turned at the swollen, hot spot where that kick had landed hard. Shadow's eyes opened a little, not all the way, just enough to meet Jamal's for a few seconds. There was still fight in them, but Jamal could see the pain there too, and it made his throat tighten until it hurt. His hands shook as he shifted to lift Shadow, looping the leash under the dog's body to help carry him. He tried to be gentle, but Shadow let out a soft, broken whine that cut straight through Jamal. He froze, panic rising, and then steadied himself, tightening his arms like he could somehow carry not just Shadow's weight, but all the pain in him too. "You did good, boy," Jamal murmured, keeping his words low, trying to calm Shadow, even though his own chest felt like it might split open. The dog's body was trembling, legs giving out under him, but Jamal wasn't going to let him fall. No matter how much his arms ached, no matter how heavy Shadow felt, Jamal kept him close. He started walking, slow and careful, feeling every step in his knees and his chest. His eyes flicked toward the place where the bullies had run off, but they were long gone, their footsteps lost to the quiet of the neighborhood. Still, Jamal could almost hear their voices in his head, already twisting the truth, already figuring out how they'd lie their way out of this. Houses came into view as he walked, and people were there too, standing in doorways, peeking out from behind curtains. He saw them watching, saw the way their eyes followed him and Shadow, but no one moved to help. They just stared like they were looking at something that wasn't their problem, like they were waiting for someone else to step in. Jamal's chest tightened even more, but he didn't let it slow him down. He kept going, step after heavy step, because Shadow needed him. He made it to the house and fumbled for the door, managing to push it open with his shoulder. Inside felt colder than it should have, emptier too. His parents weren't home, and the silence in the house felt too loud, almost like it was pressing in on him. He carried Shadow to the couch and laid him down as carefully as he could, keeping his hands on the dog like he could hold him together, just by not letting go. "You're okay," Jamal said again, brushing his hand over Shadow's fur, feeling the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He tried to steady his own breathing, tried to think. The vet's office was too far to walk, and his phone was in the kitchen. He turned to go get it, but then the sound of sirens cut through the quiet, sharp and cold, freezing him in place. His eyes snapped to the window just as red and blue lights flashed against the walls of the living room. Police cars rolled to a stop outside, and the sight of them hit Jamal like a punch to the stomach. The doors opened, and officers stepped out fast, their faces already set, already looking at his house like they knew exactly what story they were going to play out. Jamal felt his chest tighten more as he backed toward the window, peeking out between the curtains. He thought about the bullies, about the way they had run off, not scared, not ashamed, but rushing to get their version of the story out first. He could picture them lying, twisting everything around, saying whatever it took to make it look like Jamal had attacked them, like Shadow was some wild dog they had barely escaped from. The weight of it all settled on his shoulders, heavier than Shadow had been in his arms, heavier than anything he had carried before. He could see it so clearly, the way they'd spin the truth, until no one wanted to hear what really happened. The knock came hard at the door, sharp enough to make him flinch. Jamal didn't move right away, his eyes going to Shadow, who was still lying too still on the couch. His heart thudded in his chest, loud and painful, but he forced himself to take a breath, forced himself to stay steady. Whatever was about to happen, he wasn't going to hide from it. He wasn't going to let them take everything without facing them head-on. He squared his shoulders, his jaw tight, and stepped toward the door, ready to face whatever storm was waiting on the other side. Jamal's hand gripped the door handle tighter than he realized, his knuckles white against the dark metal as the second knock came, harder this time, sharp enough to rattle through the wood and settle deep in his chest. He didn't hesitate any longer. He pulled the door open, not fast, not slow, but with the kind of measured motion that came from knowing there was no good way to face what was waiting outside. Two officers stood on the porch, both in dark uniforms that seemed too polished for the kind of day it had become. The taller one, with a square jaw and eyes that had long since stopped seeing people as individuals, stepped forward without waiting for any greeting. His partner hung back by the patrol car, hand resting near his holster, though there was no threat here beyond the truth they refused to see. "Jamal Brown?" the taller officer asked, though it wasn't a question. His tone already carried the weight of decision, like a man who had read a story and skipped ahead to the ending without bothering to understand the middle. Jamal kept his expression steady, even as his heart pounded against his ribs, steady as a drum beat in a crowded room. "Yes, sir," he answered, his voice even, carrying neither fear nor defiance, just the plain truth of a young man who already understood too well how this would go. "We need you to come with us," the officer said, already stepping forward like the conversation was over before it began. "There's been an incident reported, an assault." For a moment, Jamal thought he might have heard the words wrong, that maybe there was some mistake, some chance this wasn't about him. But he knew better. He had known from the second the sirens reached his ears, from the moment the boys had run off with their lies clenched tight in their fists, that this was exactly how it would play out. "My dog is hurt," Jamal said, steadying his voice even more as he glanced back toward Shadow, lying too still on the couch behind him. "I need to get him to a vet." The officer's eyes shifted toward the dog, narrowing just enough to show that he had seen, but not enough to show that he cared. "Animal control is on the way," he replied, as though that answered anything, as though that meant help instead of more trouble. Jamal's jaw tightened, his eyes locking onto the officer's with a weight of quiet fury that ran far deeper than any words he could have chosen. Still, he kept himself in check, knowing that any spark they could twist against him would be eagerly snatched and used to darken their version of the story. Without a word, he stepped back from the door, raising his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in tired understanding. The officer moved in quickly, pulling Jamal's hands behind his back with practiced force, snapping cold metal cuffs around his wrists. They weren't rougher than necessary, but they didn't need to be. The sting wasn't in the pressure of the steel, it was in the message, the final, cruel confirmation that the truth was never going to matter as much as the story they had already decided to believe. Shadow let out a weak whine from the couch as Jamal was led out the door, his paws twitching slightly, as if some part of him still wanted to protect, still wanted to stand between Jamal and the danger closing in. Jamal's chest tightened at the sound, his eyes burning not from tears, but from the weight of helplessness settling deeper into his bones. The neighbors had gathered now, standing at their porches or peering through windows, faces tight with a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment. No one stepped forward. No one asked questions. They only watched as if they were witnessing something inevitable, something that didn't belong to them, like spectators at a scene they had seen play out too many times to care anymore. At the edge of the yard, the second officer spoke quietly into his radio, his eyes flicking toward the house before he nodded to the animal control truck pulling up behind the patrol car. Jamal's stomach twisted as the truck's door creaked open, and a man in a dull gray uniform stepped out, carrying the kind of equipment that didn't belong anywhere near Shadow, not after everything the dog had already endured. "Please," Jamal said, his voice tight but clear, directing it toward the officer holding his arm. "He needs a vet, not a cage." The officer didn't answer. His grip only tightened as he guided Jamal toward the car, pushing him down into the back seat as the animal control officer entered the house without hesitation, heading straight for Shadow, like the ending of the story had been written long before either of them could change it. Jamal twisted in his seat, watching through the glass as they moved Shadow from the couch, his body limp, his head lolling slightly to the side. His heart pounded against his chest, helpless to do anything more than witness the final blow land like a hammer on an already splintering shield. The door of the patrol car closed with a hollow thud, sealing him inside, cutting him off from everything but the tight coil of fury and grief wrapping itself tighter around his chest. As the car pulled away from the curb, he kept his eyes on the house until it disappeared from view, until the only thing left was the sick feeling in his stomach and the knowledge that this was not over, not even close. Because even as they drove him away, as they pinned their false version of events onto his name, Jamal knew something deeper had been set in motion, something he could feel in his bones, in the fire that, no matter how hard they tried to cage him, would not go out. The ride to the station felt longer than it should have, the silence in the back of the patrol car pressing down on Jamal like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating. He kept his eyes forward, watching the streets roll past the window, each familiar landmark blurring by, but his mind stayed stuck back at the house, stuck on Shadow's limp body being carried away like some kind of threat, instead of the loyal friend he had always been. The officer driving said nothing, his hands firm on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead like he was following a route he had taken 100 times before. Jamal wanted to speak, to ask about Shadow, to demand answers, but he knew it would be wasted breath. These men weren't here to listen. They were here to deliver him to whatever version of justice had already been decided. As the car pulled into the station lot, the officer finally broke the silence, though his words were sharp and empty. "Keep it clean, Brown. No sudden moves." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. Then, as the officer came around to open the door and grab his arm, Jamal spoke, his voice low but steady, every word deliberate. "I didn't do anything," he said, looking the officer straight in the eyes, forcing him to see him not as a story someone else had told, but as a person standing in front of him. The officer's expression didn't change. "Save it for the desk sergeant," he replied, as if Jamal's words were nothing more than background noise. They led him through the side entrance, past blank walls and dull floors, the station filled with the hum of phones and quiet conversations that all felt too normal for the storm brewing inside his chest. He heard his own name before he saw the desk, caught in passing between two officers leaning by the copier. "That's the Brown kid," one of them said, his voice just low enough to think Jamal might not hear. But Jamal caught every word. "They say he set his dog on those boys like some kind of weapon." Jamal's hands curled into fists inside the cuffs, the metal biting into his wrists. He wanted to shout the truth, wanted to tear down every lie twisting the air around him, but he held back, locking the fire inside where they couldn't touch it. At the desk, a sergeant looked him over with tired eyes, as though Jamal was just another box to check off before the end of the shift. "Name," the man said, flipping through a clipboard without even looking up. "Jamal Brown," Jamal answered, keeping his voice clear, refusing to let them turn him into just another number in their files. The sergeant's gaze flicked up then, eyes narrowing slightly. "You know why you're here?" "I know what they're saying," Jamal replied, meeting his stare without flinching. "But it's a lie." The sergeant gave a non-committal grunt, like he'd heard it all before, then nodded to the officer beside him. Get him processed. They led Jamal down the hall to a small, windowless room with dull gray walls and a table that had seen too many stories like his unfold beneath the flickering lights overhead. They uncuffed him long enough to sit him down across from a detective who walked in holding a thin folder, his expression caught somewhere between boredom and suspicion. The detective dropped the folder on the table and opened it slowly, as if giving the weight of the moment some kind of importance, though it was clear his mind was already made up. "Jamal Brown," he started, tapping a pen against the folder's spine. "We've got statements saying you attacked 3 students from your school, used your dog to go after them, left them with injuries serious enough to need treatment. That sound right to you?" "No," Jamal said firmly, keeping his voice even. "That's not what happened." The detective raised an eyebrow, flipping through the papers like he was flipping through a story he'd heard 1,000 times. "They say you sicked the dog on them, that you let the animal loose when they tried to pass you in the park." "They came after me," Jamal replied, the words sharp but controlled. "They circled me, they pushed me, and they went after my dog first. He only fought because they hurt him." The detective leaned back in his chair, studying Jamal like he was something under a microscope. "Funny," he said slowly, "because the boys say different. They've got bruises, cuts, a bite mark. Makes you look bad, kid." "They're lying," Jamal said, his eyes never leaving the detective's face. "They're lying to cover what they did." The detective sighed, like he had already decided this was a waste of time. "Maybe they are," he said, almost casually, "but right now, they've got parents making calls and you've got a dog in custody, and a story that doesn't match the one we've already got lined up." Jamal's chest tightened at those words, his breath catching for a second as his mind snapped back to Shadow. "Where is my dog?" he asked, his voice lower now, rougher, edged with something colder than fear. "What are they doing to him?" The detective didn't answer right away. He closed the folder and stood, collecting his papers like they were the last word on the matter. "You'll have to ask animal control about that," he said, his tone flat. "But if I were you, I'd start thinking about how you're going to explain all this when it goes to court." As the door closed behind the detective, Jamal sat alone in the quiet room, the words swirling in his head like cold wind through an open window. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clenched together, as if holding onto something that couldn't be taken from him, something they couldn't twist with their lies. No matter what they said, no matter how many stories they stacked against him, the truth hadn't changed. And deep down, even with everything closing in around him, Jamal felt it burning like a steady flame, refusing to go out. The hours that followed blurred together in a way that Jamal couldn't even begin to untangle, every moment folding into the next, like a heavy fog settling over him. He sat in that cold room far longer than they needed to keep him, long after the questions had stopped, long after the detective had left him alone with his thoughts and the quiet hum of the overhead light. There had been no answers, no updates about Shadow, no hint of anyone even pretending to care about the truth he had given them. When they finally moved him, it wasn't with any sense of urgency or concern, but more like they were clearing a space that had been occupied too long, like they had better things to do than hold him there. The officer who led him out said nothing, didn't bother to look at him as they walked the dull, lifeless hallway back toward the front of the station. As they passed the front desk, Jamal's eyes caught on a conversation between 2 officers, their voices low but not low enough to stop him from hearing. "They're putting the dog down," one of them said, his words sharp and careless, like he was talking about garbage being hauled away, not a living creature who had just fought to protect his owner. Jamal stopped walking, his chest tightening in an instant, the breath catching hard in his throat. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice pushing out rougher than he intended, but too full of urgency to hold back. The officer escorting him tightened his grip on Jamal's arm and pulled him forward, ignoring the question like it hadn't been spoken at all. "No," Jamal snapped, planting his feet as best he could with his arms still cuffed in front of him. "What did you just say about my dog?" The 2 officers by the desk glanced his way, one of them shifting uncomfortably, as if realizing too late that Jamal had heard every word. The other, older and less concerned, shrugged his shoulders like it was nothing worth hiding. "Animal control made the call," he said plainly, as if explaining a routine task on a checklist. "Dog was too aggressive. Bit a kid bad enough to need stitches. Liability!" Jamal's heart felt like it slammed against his ribs, each beat pounding louder in his ears. His mouth went dry, and for a second, it was hard to even form words through the anger that climbed up his throat. "You didn't even let me explain," he managed to force out, his voice rough but steady beneath the weight of what he had just heard. "He was defending me. He was only trying to protect me." The officer with the clipboard shook his head, not with regret, but with the kind of cold indifference that said he'd heard it all before and had never cared. "Doesn't matter," he replied flatly. "The reports say he attacked unprovoked. They don't take chances with dogs like that. Dogs like that." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the chest, because he could hear exactly what they meant, exactly how little they saw of Shadow's loyalty, his bravery, the years of quiet companionship and fierce protection, all of it reduced to a line in a report and a decision made behind closed doors. Jamal's throat tightened as he swallowed against the rising fury, his hands clenching into fists despite the cuffs that bit into his wrists. "You had no right," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet fire that refused to die. "You had no right to do that." The officer escorting him gave him a hard nudge, steering him toward the waiting area without a flicker of sympathy. "Save it, Brown," he muttered under his breath. "It's done." The weight of those words settled deep into Jamal's chest as he was led forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. He felt like the floor beneath his feet might give way at any moment, like the entire station was closing in around him, trapping him in a place where truth and justice had no place at all. When they finally unfastened the cuffs and left him in a small, cluttered waiting area, he sat down hard in one of the plastic chairs, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands laced together as he stared at the floor. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, lost in the noise of his own thoughts, the image of Shadow flashing over and over in his mind, the way he had fought so fiercely, the way he had looked back at Jamal, even when his body had already started to give out. Minutes later, the station doors opened, and his parents came rushing in, their faces drawn tight with worry and fear. His mother's eyes found him first, and she hurried across the room, dropping to her knees in front of him, her hands cupping his face like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "Jamal, baby, are you hurt?" she asked, her voice tight with panic, her eyes searching him from head to toe as if trying to see every invisible wound. His father stood close behind, jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides, his whole body stiff with rage that simmered just beneath the surface. "They said you attacked those boys," his father said, his voice low and hard, like he could barely force the words out past his teeth. "They said you set Shadow on them." "They're lying," Jamal answered right away. No hesitation, no doubt. His eyes burned as he looked from his mother to his father, his voice steady even as pain tightened his chest. "They started it. They pushed me. They went after Shadow. And he just tried to protect me. They're lying about everything." His mother's eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall, her throat working as she swallowed down her heartbreak. She brushed a hand over his cheek, her touch gentle but full of strength, like she was trying to hold him together with her own will. His father's jaw tightened even more as he turned away, pacing a short line across the small room before turning back toward them. "We're getting a lawyer," he said firmly, the words sounding like a promise more than a plan. "We're not letting them do this to you." Jamal swallowed hard, his chest tight with the weight of everything they had already lost, and everything that was still slipping through their fingers. He forced himself to nod, holding on to that small thread of hope, even as the ache in his chest told him that this fight was going to be longer and harder than anything he had ever faced before. "They already took him," Jamal said quietly, his voice rough as he looked down at his hands. "They already put him down." His mother's breath caught, sharp and painful, her hands tightening around his like she could somehow ease the hurt by holding on tighter. His father's eyes darkened with fury, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that they trembled. But none of it changed the truth. Shadow was gone, and Jamal knew, as sure as the air in his lungs, that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The ride home was quiet. No one said much after they left the station. Jamal sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the town passed him by. Every corner and familiar street now feeling colder, sharper, more distant than before. His mother drove with both hands locked on the wheel, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her mouth set in a hard line. His father sat stiffly in the passenger seat, arms crossed over his chest, shoulders tense like he was holding in everything he wanted to say, but couldn't without breaking something. Nobody had the energy to speak, not after what they'd learned, not after hearing that Shadow was gone. When they pulled into the driveway, Jamal stepped out of the car before it had fully stopped moving. He didn't wait for anyone. He just walked toward the front door, pushing it open with more force than he meant to, and moved inside without looking back. The house felt different. The air inside was still, heavy in a way it hadn't been before, as if something important had been taken, and the place itself hadn't figured out how to breathe without it. He stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around him. Then he stepped into the living room and looked at the couch. The blanket was still tossed across the corner where Shadow used to rest his head. One of his toys, a worn-out rubber bone, sat just a few feet away on the floor. Jamal stared at it for a second, and then he walked over, bent down, and picked it up. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the rough edges, the bite marks worn into the surface, the faint smell of the dog who'd fought harder for him than anyone ever had. He sat down slowly, his hand still wrapped around the toy, and for a while he just sat there, saying nothing, letting everything he'd been holding in start to come up. Not as tears, not as panic, but as something deeper. A slow, rising heat that started in his chest and spread like a flame beneath his skin. They took him. They didn't ask. They didn't wait. They didn't listen. They just took him. They called him a threat. They believed the lies without question. They let those boys twist everything. And then they made it final. And now, Shadow was gone, buried by a system that never gave Jamal a chance to speak before it made up its mind. He tightened his grip around the toy and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the floor like he was trying to burn through it. He didn't know when it happened exactly, but somewhere in that silence the grief turned. It stopped being just pain. It became something else, sharper, colder, something that sat heavy in his gut and started whispering the same thing over and over. They did this. Mark, Kyle, Tanner, they didn't just lie. They stole something from him. They took Shadow. They tore up his name, painted him as violent, dangerous, all because they knew they could. All because they knew people would believe them before they ever even gave Jamal a chance. And now they were probably laughing, sitting in their big houses with their families telling them everything would be fine. Maybe one of them even posted about it already, spinning some version of the story where they were heroes, victims who barely made it out alive. Jamal sat up straighter, still holding the toy in one hand, his other hand resting on his knee. His jaw tightened as the thoughts kept rolling in, building one on top of the other like bricks stacked to the ceiling. They thought it was over. They thought they could walk away, clean and untouched, while he sat here picking up the pieces. They thought he'd take the blame, that he'd disappear, fade out like so many others before him. But they were wrong. He stood, moving slowly, but with a different kind of weight in his steps now. He walked to his room, opened his closet, and pulled out the old bag his uncle used to bring to the gym. It still had the gloves inside, the wraps, the pads, all of it worn and faded, but solid, reliable. He placed the bag on the bed and stood there for a minute, just looking at it. "I'm done waiting," he said to himself, the words firm, not shouted, but full of purpose. He pulled out the gloves and slipped his hands into them, not to train, not yet, but just to feel the weight again. The leather still smelled like sweat and dust, like hours spent in the gym under harsh lights and louder voices. He remembered his uncle's voice, calm and steady, always telling him, "You don't swing wild. You don't waste moves. You study, you plan, you wait until it matters." Jamal looked in the mirror on the wall, staring at the reflection in front of him. The same face, but not the same person. Not anymore. "I'm not letting this go," he whispered. "Not this time." He took the gloves off, packed them back into the bag, zipped it shut, and set it by the door. Then he sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began to pull up names, social media profiles, anything he could find on them, where they went, who they knew, what they were hiding behind. If they had secrets, he would find them. If they had weak spots, he'd know exactly where to press. He wasn't going to confront them yet. He wasn't going to charge in fists swinging. He was going to study them, watch them, learn everything he needed. And when the time came, when it really mattered, he would make sure they felt everything he felt, and more. They were going to pay for what they did. Not all at once, piece by piece. And this time, no one was going to stop him. His plan had taken shape earlier, sitting there in that cold waiting room at the station, while his parents fought back tears and clenched their fists in frustration. It came to him not as a flash of rage, but as a cold, steady certainty. If the system wasn't going to deliver justice, then he would. Not in a blind, reckless way that would land him right back in handcuffs, not in a way that would leave behind pieces of himself for them to pick apart and use against him. He would be smarter than that. Cleaner. He would handle it with precision, like a fighter in the ring picking his moment, waiting for the perfect opening before landing the punch that couldn't be taken back. They'd be expecting him to crumble, maybe to yell, to fall apart in public, to swing wild and give them exactly what they wanted. A target, a clear story, another excuse to call him violent. He wasn't going to give them that. He wasn't going to give them anything, but they were going to give him everything. He sat back in his chair, his hands clasped together as he let the shape of the plan settle in his mind. Smooth and solid. He would wait until the right moment, when the three of them were together, feeling safe in their numbers, convinced they had already won. And then, when they least expected it, he would take them all down at once. 1 versus 3. No hesitation, no wasted time. Quick, brutal, and clean. No phones recording. No bystanders watching. No way to tie it back to him. He stood from the desk, crossing the room with steady steps, his eyes on the old gym bag waiting by the door. He unzipped it and pulled out his gloves, turning them over in his hands. He didn't bother putting them on this time. These fights weren't going to happen in a ring with rules and referees. This wasn't about scoring points. This was about sending a message they'd never forget. The kind that lived in their bones long after bruises faded. "They'll never see it coming," he said quietly to himself, his voice firm, grounded in the weight of the choice he had made. He thought back to everything his uncle had taught him, every lesson hammered into him in the gym, not just about throwing punches, but about understanding the rhythm of a fight. You don't rush. You don't let your anger do the thinking. You let them make the first mistake, and then you make them pay for it 10 times over. He thought about Mark Pearson's cocky grin, Kyle Miller's smug laughter, Tanner McKee's sneers and cheap shots. He thought about how they had chased him down, pushed him, kicked shadow, lied to the police, and walked away like it was just another game to them. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with purpose. "They think they're safe," he said under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he set the gloves back in the bag. "They think it's over." But it wasn't over. Not for him, not for Shadow. Not until every one of them paid the price for what they did. He spent the rest of the night going over the details in his mind, working through every step until it felt solid under his feet. He thought about their routines, about where they hung out after school, about the places they felt comfortable, where they let their guards down because they believed no one would dare touch them. He thought about back streets and dead-end corners, places where the light didn't reach and the crowd wouldn't follow. He wouldn't come at them in broad daylight. He wouldn't shout their names or warn them it was coming. He would pick his spot, time it right, and strike so fast they wouldn't even have time to process it before it was already done. No hesitation. No mistakes. He would take all three of them at once, crush their confidence in one brutal moment, and leave them with no story to tell except the truth written in every bruise and broken breath. They would never know for sure it was him. They might suspect, they might point fingers in their private circles, but they wouldn't be able to prove it. Not in the way they'd need to. And by the time they realized what had happened, Jamal would already be gone, leaving behind nothing but the lesson they were long overdue to learn. As the first light of morning crept through the blinds, he stood tall, feeling the weight of the decision settle into something almost like relief. Not because it was over, but because now, finally, he knew exactly what had to be done, and he was ready. The night had settled over the town like a heavy blanket, quieting the streets and leaving only the occasional rustle of trees in the wind and the low hum of faraway traffic. Jamal kept to the shadows, his hoodie drawn low over his face, his hands tucked in his pockets, the weight of what he was about to do steady in his chest. There was no fear, no doubt, just the same cold focus that had carried him through days of careful watching and patient waiting. This was the moment he had been building toward. Not rushed, not loud, but timed just right. He had seen them leave practice late every Thursday, cutting across the side alley behind the gym to avoid the longer walk to the parking lot. There were no lights back here, no cameras, just a narrow stretch of cracked pavement hemmed in by tall chain-link fences and the backs of storage sheds. It was perfect. He had walked this route himself a dozen times over the past few nights, memorizing every inch of it, the rhythm of their footsteps, the way their voices bounced off the walls when they thought they were alone and safe. And now, as they approached, laughing and shoving at each other, completely unaware of the trap closing around them, Jamal felt a quiet, grim satisfaction settle into place. Man, I swear, that new kid nearly tripped over himself just trying to get out of my way today. Kyle's voice carried through the night, full of his usual empty bravado. You should have seen the look on his face, Tanner added, his laugh sharp and ugly, echoing against the fence. Mark scoffed louder than both of them, his voice carrying a lazy confidence that made Jamal's fists curl tighter in his pockets. Bunch of scared little punks. Just like Brown. Thought he was a fighter until we put him in his place. The mention of his name stirred no reaction in Jamal's chest. No spike of anger or slip of control. He kept his pace slow, his steps quiet along the edge of the building, his breath even. They didn't see him yet, their eyes still in the middle of their own little world, blind to what was coming. When he stepped from the shadows, just far enough into the open to catch their attention, they froze. What the hell? Kyle started, his voice breaking just a bit. Who's that? Tanner asked, squinting into the dim light, trying to make sense of the figure standing in their path. Mark took a step forward, always the first to pretend he wasn't afraid. Yo, you lost or something? He called out, though Jamal could hear the tightening in his tone, the doubt creeping in. Jamal said nothing, kept his head slightly bowed beneath the hood, the shadows hiding enough of his face to leave them unsure. He wanted them to guess, to fear, but never to know for certain. His silence pulled them further off balance, and as he stepped closer, Their bravado began to crack. "Hey!" Mark barked again, louder this time, the forced courage thin beneath the edge of unease. "You deaf, man? I said you lost?" Jamal kept moving, his steps even, his posture loose but ready. He saw Kyle reach for something in his pocket, probably nothing more than his phone or his keys, but Jamal didn't give him the chance to think twice. He exploded into motion, faster than they could react, closing the gap in a blink. His first punch came low and hard, slamming into Kyle's gut and folding him over with a grunt of shocked pain. Before Kyle could crumple fully, Jamal followed with an elbow across his temple, snapping his head to the side and sending him crashing to the ground. "What the?" Tanner shouted, stumbling back as he tried to process what was happening. Mark lunged at Jamal with a snarl, swinging wild, but Jamal's training took over. He ducked beneath the clumsy punch and drove a sharp jab straight into Mark's ribs, feeling the impact reverberate up his arm as Mark sucked in a wheezing breath. "You picked the wrong guys to mess with," Mark spat, his voice cracking under the strain of his breath as he tried to shake off the pain. "You picked the wrong dog to kick," Jamal replied coldly, his voice rough but level, pitched just low enough to remain unfamiliar to their ears, just distorted enough to keep the mask intact. Mark swung again, but Jamal caught his wrist mid-air, twisted sharply, and brought his knee up into Mark's stomach with brutal force. Mark doubled over, coughing hard, and Jamal drove his forearm down between Mark's shoulder blades, dropping him hard to the pavement. Tanner, realizing too late that they were outmatched, let out a shaky breath and charged, hoping to overwhelm by surprise. Jamal sidestepped him easily, caught him by the back of his jacket, and yanked him off his feet, slamming him back against the chain-link fence with a metallic rattle that filled the alley. "Who is this guy?" Tanner gasped, struggling against the fence as Jamal's grip tightened. "I don't know," Kyle groaned from the ground, clutching his side, blood at the corner of his mouth. "I don't know. I can't see." Jamal twisted Tanner's arm behind his back, not enough to break it, but enough to keep him pinned and helpless. He spoke quietly, just loud enough for them to hear, his voice steady and full of weight. "You don't need to see me," he said. "You just need to feel this." And with that, he drove Tanner down hard to the ground, Tanner's breath bursting out of him in a panicked wheeze. Mark tried to crawl away, dragging himself along the pavement, but Jamal stepped after him without rush, without hesitation, like a storm rolling in slow and unstoppable. "You're dead, man," Mark shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. "When we find out who you are, you're dead." "You won't find out," Jamal answered, the words like stone as he grabbed Mark by the collar and dragged him back toward the center of the alley, where the others lay broken and gasping. The fight wasn't finished, not yet. He still had more to give them, more than they deserved, but exactly what they needed to understand. They were not invincible, and he was far from done. Mark's breath came in ragged, uneven pulls as Jamal dragged him back across the rough pavement, his hands scrambling weakly at the ground, his shoes scraping uselessly as he tried to find some way to resist. But Jamal's grip was solid, his hold unbreakable, and there was no chance of escape. Not here. Not now. Behind him, Kyle was groaning, still doubled over where Jamal had left him, blood trickling from his split lip, his breath wheezing through clenched teeth. Tanner shifted on the ground, coughing hard, his back pressed to the chain-link fence like he was trying to disappear into the metal itself. They were all struggling, all gasping for breath, all realizing far too late that the fight had never been in their favor. "You think you're tough, huh?" Mark spat, though his voice shook beneath the thin layer of defiance he was trying to hold on to. 3 against 1. You really think you've won something? Jamal didn't answer right away. He tightened his grip on Mark's collar, forcing him to face the truth of the moment. The shadows hid most of Jamal's features, but the weight in his gaze cut through the dark without needing to be seen. "This was never about winning," Jamal said, his voice low, steady, and full of quiet finality. It was about finishing what you started. Without waiting for a reply, he yanked Mark off his feet and drove his knee into Mark's stomach with brutal force, folding him in half with a broken sound that barely escaped his throat. Mark sagged in Jamal's grasp, all the air knocked clean from his body, his arms hanging useless at his sides. Kyle saw it happen and forced himself to his knees, panic flaring in his eyes as he coughed out, "Leave him alone, man! What do you even want from us?" Jamal turned his head slowly, his stare locking onto Kyle like a storm cloud about to break. "I want you to feel it," he answered, his voice sharp and cold enough to chill the blood in their veins. "Every second of it." He let Mark crumple to the ground and moved toward Kyle with purpose, his steps calm, each one heavy with intent. Kyle tried to scramble backward, pushing himself across the pavement on his palms and heels, but there was nowhere left to run. "Wait! Wait! Just wait!" Kyle stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. "We didn't mean it. We didn't mean for it to go that far." But Jamal was already there, already reaching down and grabbing Kyle by the front of his jacket, lifting him halfway to his feet before driving a powerful punch into his ribs. Kyle let out a sharp, broken cry, his knees buckling as the pain tore through him. "You didn't mean it?" Jamal repeated, his words tight with disbelief, as he landed another heavy blow, this time to Kyle's jaw, snapping his head to the side. "You meant every second of it." Kyle sagged in Jamal's grip, gasping for breath, too beaten to argue any further. Jamal let him drop, his eyes shifting to Tanner, who was now trying to climb the fence like it might offer a way out, his legs shaky beneath him, his hands clawing at the cold metal. "Don't!" Tanner cried out, his voice pitched high with desperation. "Stay away from me!" But Jamal closed the distance in just a few strides, his body moving with the same ruthless efficiency that had carried him through the fight from the first blow. He grabbed Tanner by the back of his jacket and yanked him away from the fence, slamming him hard against the wall of the nearest storage shed. The impact rattled through Tanner's bones, leaving him slumped against the metal, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with terror. "You thought you'd walk away clean," Jamal said quietly, his words a cold promise rather than a threat. "But there's no walking away from this." Tanner whimpered, too winded to speak, too broken to run. Jamal's gaze swept across the three of them, scattered and ruined across the alley, the echoes of their earlier bravado long gone, replaced only by fear and pain. They had nothing left. No lies to shield them, no crowd to cheer them on, no teacher or parent to pull them out of this fire. "You don't even know who I am," Jamal finished, his voice steady and sharp as a blade. "But you'll never forget this." Mark, still clutching his ribs on the ground, let out a weak, shuddering breath, his eyes narrow slits as he fought to keep them open. We'll find out," he gasped. But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. His fear had bled too deep. His fear had bled too deep. "No," Jamal said, stepping back slowly, his pulse even, his breath calm. "You won't." He took one last look at the wreckage he had left behind, at the three bullies who had once strutted across the school halls like kings, but were now reduced to broken shapes beneath the night sky. He had done exactly what he came for, no more, no less, and he had done it clean. No names spoken, no face shown, no witnesses, nothing left behind but pain and memory. Without another word, Jamal turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the shadows as the night swallowed him whole. He didn't look back, didn't need to. He could feel the weight of their silence behind him, heavy and permanent, the kind that would follow them long after their bruises healed. The storm had passed through, and it had left them changed. And as Jamal disappeared into the dark, the only thing they had left was the cold, empty truth. They had no idea who had come for them, but they would never, ever forget. They thought they could move on, that a few days would be enough to shake off the beating. enough to pretend it had never happened. But as the bruises darkened and the pain settled deeper into their bones, something colder and sharper than any punch Jamal had landed began to take hold of them. Fear. It started small, creeping into their thoughts in the quiet moments between classes or in the dead space of the night, when the noise of their own bravado wasn't enough to drown it out. Mark found himself checking over his shoulder more than once as he walked through the school hallways, his eyes flicking to every shadow, every face that lingered too long in his direction. His ribs still ached every time he breathed too deeply, a tight reminder of how helpless he had been in that alley. He wore his jacket zipped up high to cover the bruises along his collarbone, but it did nothing to shield him from the memory of the blows that had left them there. Kyle wasn't much better. He moved stiffly through the hallways, his eyes sunken with restless nights where sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same scene playing out again, the dark figure stepping from the shadows, the cold, steady voice that never rose in anger, but carried more weight than any scream. He had told himself it was just a fluke, just bad luck. But the more he thought about it, the less he believed his own lies. "You think it was him?" Kyle whispered one afternoon, his voice low and hoarse as he cornered Mark by the lockers. His eyes darted around nervously, checking to make sure no one else could hear. "You think it was Brown?" Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer. He wanted to say no, wanted to push the thought away like it was nothing more than a bad dream. But he couldn't shake the way the stranger had moved, too controlled, too precise, too familiar. "I don't know," Mark muttered, his voice thick with something he didn't want to name. "But even if it was, we can't prove it." Tanner, who had been lingering at the edge of their conversation, rubbed at the fading bruise on his neck and swallowed hard. "Maybe we just let it go," he said, his voice thin. "We don't talk about it. We act like it never happened, but it had happened. It had happened, and no matter how many times they tried to bury it, the memory kept clawing its way back to the surface. It lived in the way people looked at them now, in the sideways glances from classmates who had noticed the way they limped into school, the way they avoided eye contact, the way they flinched at loud noises. Whispers followed them down the halls, too quiet to catch fully but loud enough to feel in their skin. Nobody knew the full story. Nobody had seen the fight, but the rumors spread fast anyway. Faster than truth, faster than lies, twisting through the student body like wildfire fed by fear and curiosity. Some said they had been jumped by a gang. Others said it was revenge for what they had done to that dog. Shadow, though nobody dared speak too loudly about that. No matter the version, one thing stayed the same in every telling. The three of them had been beaten badly, and whoever had done it had left no trail. At night, the fear pressed even heavier against them. Mark kept the light on in his room, the soft yellow glow doing little to push away the image of that shadowed figure rising out of the dark. He heard noises in the house that never bothered him before, the creak of the floorboards, the shifting groan of the pipes, and every time his heart would jump into his throat, like he expected the stranger to step out of the darkness again. Kyle barely left his house after sunset, making excuses about homework or feeling sick whenever his friends tried to pull him back out. Even at school, he walked with his shoulders hunched and his eyes lowered, like he could make himself small enough to disappear altogether. Tanner fared no better. His parents had started asking questions after finding his blood-stained jacket shoved deep in the back of his closet. And while he had managed to lie his way out of the worst of it, their eyes lingered on him longer now, filled with quiet suspicion and disappointment. He could feel it every time he sat at the dinner table, their silence louder than any accusation. "They're gonna come again," Tanner had whispered to Mark late one afternoon, his voice tight with fear that no amount of bravado could hide. "I know they are." Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. The fear had settled too deep in all of them, and no amount of tough talk could push it back. They were trapped now, not by fists or threats, but by the memory of how powerless they had been, by the cold knowledge that someone out there had seen them for what they really were, weak beneath all the noise, vulnerable beneath all the swagger. They could guess all they wanted. They could point fingers in private, throw names around behind closed doors, but deep down, they understood the truth that kept them awake at night and made their hands tremble when they thought no one was watching. They had no proof, no names, no way to fight back. Only fear, eating at them from the inside, day by day. And Jamal, wherever he was, remained untouchable. Jamal saw it unfolding, piece by piece, slower than he had imagined it would. But in some ways, that made it all the more satisfying. It wasn't loud. There were no announcements, no explosions, no dramatic falls from grace. It was quiet, like a house settling into decay, like something that had always seemed so solid had started to rot from the inside out, the damage spreading deeper with every passing day. He watched Mark first, not out of spite, but because it was impossible not to notice how far he had fallen already. In the mornings, Mark moved stiffly through the hallways, the weight of every step pressing on his bruised ribs, though he tried to mask it beneath the same forced swagger he'd always worn. But it wasn't the same anymore. Jamal could see the pain in the way Mark winced when he twisted too fast, the way he adjusted his bag over his shoulder like he was hiding an injury deeper than the surface bruises showed. During practice, Mark lagged behind, slower than the others, his body betraying him in small, humiliating ways. Jamal had passed the field once or twice, just far enough away to blend into the background, and he had caught the sharp tone of the coach, barking at Mark to pick up the pace, to push harder. But no matter how Mark gritted his teeth and pushed through, Jamal could see the truth plain as day. Mark was breaking, and it wasn't just him. Kyle, who had once run the length of the field like it belonged to him, now moved like he was chasing echoes of his former self. Jamal saw him stumble more than once, favoring his knee, his eyes dark with frustration and fear, as he tried to hide the limp that always crept back when he thought no one was looking. But Jamal saw. He saw every falter, every grimace of pain that flickered across Kyle's face before he could swallow it down. He had known, from the moment his fist had driven into Kyle's side, that the injury would linger. Not just the physical hurt, though that alone was enough to sideline him from any serious future in sports, but the deeper wound, the one that stole a man's confidence, that ate away at his belief that he could outrun his past. Kyle wouldn't be outrunning this. And then there was Tanner, who had once been the loudest of them all, always ready with some sharp word or cheap laugh at someone else's expense. Now, Tanner barely raised his voice above a whisper, his jokes brittle, his eyes darting over his shoulder like he was waiting for shadows to reach out and grab him again. Jamal had seen him in class, staring blankly at his papers, his mind clearly far from the room. His grades had started slipping. Teachers noticed, classmates noticed, but no one said much. Jamal doubted Tanner even cared anymore. Jamal carried no hatred when he saw it. There was no heat in him, no burning desire for more. He simply saw it for what it was, the natural, quiet collapse of boys who had believed too much in their own invincibility. They had built their world on fear and cruelty, had walked through the school like they were made of iron, like no force could ever bend them. And now, they were rusting from the inside out, their edges crumbling in ways they couldn't repair. He never spoke to them. He never needed to. It was better this way, watching from a distance, seeing the consequences take root without lifting another finger. Let them wonder if it had been him that night. Let them guess and second-guess until it drove them mad. They had no proof, no clear face in the dark, no name to shout in blame. Only shadows, only memories, only fear. And Jamal, for the first time in a long time, felt light in his chest. They had taken something from him. They had stolen a part of his life, that he could never fully get back. Shadow was gone, and no amount of justice could change that hard truth. But standing here, watching them stumble beneath the weight of their own downfall, Jamal felt a quiet kind of peace settle over him. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was enough. Their scholarships would slip through their fingers, their names once carved into the team's future, already fading like old chalk on a blackboard. Colleges would stop calling. Coaches would stop watching. Friends would pull away, unsure if they wanted to stay close to sinking ships. The world had a way of forgetting people like them once they stopped being useful. Jamal had no plans to gloat. He had no need to spread the story. He simply walked his path, quiet and steady, feeling the air a little clearer in his lungs, the weight of injustice finally easing off his shoulders. The past didn't own him anymore. They didn't own him anymore. He moved forward, leaving them behind in the ruins of what they had built for themselves, carrying only the lessons that mattered and the quiet, unshakable truth. Some things they would never recover from, and Jamal would never let them forget it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, fading light across the edges of the yard, stretching the shadows long over the grass that had started to grow a little wilder than it used to. Jamal walked slowly, his steps measured, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket as the cool air brushed against his skin. The quiet of the place felt heavier than usual, but not in a way that pressed him down. No, this kind of quiet felt right, like the earth itself had decided to fall still for this moment. He stopped in front of the small, simple marker beneath the old oak tree. It wasn't fancy, just a flat stone set into the ground, the name Shadow carved into it with steady hands, surrounded by a few small wildflowers his mother had planted weeks ago. Jamal crouched down slowly, letting his fingers brush across the cool surface of the stone, tracing the letters like he was memorizing them all over again, even though he already carried them in his chest every single day. For a long moment, he just stayed there, saying nothing, letting the breeze carry through the leaves overhead, letting the silence hold the weight of what he wanted to say. His throat tightened, but not with the sharpness of grief the way it had before. This was something else. This was something softer, quieter, something that sat deep in his chest, but didn't press against him the way it once had. "I miss you, boy," Jamal said at last, his voice low but steady as it drifted into the open air. He let his palm rest flat against the stone, feeling the rough edges beneath his skin, grounding himself in the moment. Every single day. The words hung there for a breath, and then he drew in a slow, steady breath, lifting his gaze to the horizon where the light was beginning to slip behind the rooftops in the distance. "They thought they could take everything from us," he continued, his eyes still fixed on the fading sky, his tone not bitter, not angry, just quiet and certain. "They thought they'd get away clean, like it was just a game, like you were just something they could kick aside without ever having to feel it afterward." A slow shake of his head followed. A slight breath pushed from his chest, part ache, part release. "But they're feeling it now," he went on, his voice deepening with the truth of it. "Every day they wake up, and it's still there. They can't run from it. They can't shake it off. Their futures, the ones they used to brag about, the ones they thought were guaranteed, they're slipping through their fingers like sand." He thought about Mark, moving stiffly down the hallways, weighed down by injuries that wouldn't heal fast enough to save his place on the team. He thought about Kyle, wincing with every step, the fire gone from his legs, the calls from scouts growing quieter with every missed practice. He thought about Tanner, folding in on himself like a man shrinking from his own shadow, his grades sinking, his spark gone. "They're failing," Jamal said softly, almost to himself. But the words felt good to say aloud, felt right to give to the space where Shadow rested. "They're falling apart in ways they can't fix, and maybe someday they'll pull themselves together. Maybe they'll scrape by and try to forget what they did, but not now, not for a long time." He let his fingers brush across the stone once more, his touch lingering there, steady and sure. "They're going to carry this," he said, his gaze dropping back to the marker, his eyes holding steady. "They're going to carry it just like I carry you." His chest rose with a full breath, and this time it wasn't heavy. It was clean, clear, as though some part of the weight had finally lifted from him, as though speaking the truth here, in this quiet place where it mattered most, had given him a kind of peace he hadn't known he was still chasing. "I kept my promise," Jamal said softly. "They paid for what they did to you, for what they tried to do to me." The breeze stirred again, lifting the edges of his jacket, brushing gently across his skin, and for a moment he let his eyes close, feeling the cool air as it passed through the yard, as it rustled the leaves above him. "You protected me every day," he said, his voice low but strong, "and I made sure they never forget it." There was no need to say more. He didn't need to explain the details, didn't need to list out the damage done. He had lived it, he had delivered it, and now, as he rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his palms, he carried with him not grief, not anger, but something quieter and stronger, a quiet, earned satisfaction that filled his chest and pushed back the ache just enough to let him breathe fully again. As he turned away from the grave, his eyes lingered once more on the marker beneath the tree. He let a faint, steady nod pass before he stepped away, his stride sure, his heart firm. The past no longer weighed on his shoulders. It stood behind him, finished and settled. And Jamal, moving forward into the rest of his life, carried not just the memory of what had been lost, but the strength of knowing justice had been served, not in noise or spectacle, but in quiet, undeniable truth. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.